this year marks the 50 years anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War. And in fact, if I do the math, I've been to America exactly 50 years and 5 months in America. Give on and off the years that I live abroad. That's a long time, half a century in America. Before I read my work, I just want to talk about how it's amazing to see the evolution of Vietnamese American literature since I started out writing all those years ago. And that must have been like 1990, when I started getting published. Because 1988, I left Berkeley as a biochem major. And my parents say, aren't you going to medical school? I say, no, I'm going to creative writing school. And my mom said, oh my God, I knew sending you to Berkeley was a mistake because now you become a hippie. And I'm like, she associated Berkeley with hippies. And I said, no, Mom, I'm getting my MFA in creative writing. And my dad said, can you name a Vietnamese in America making a living writing in English? In 1988, the diaspora of Vietnamese in US is only 13 years old. I mean, we left in 1975, that's when we left. And so most people are still trying to learn English and maybe find a second job so they can buy a house, right? And here's this cheeky little kid who said, I'm gonna be an American writer, So everyone was waiting for me to fail. So I told my dad, I'm gonna be the first. I'm going to be the first to write in English and make a living. And I think that was the first time my father looked at me with new set of eyes, like, so he's going to be his own man after all, that sort of thing. And then I thought, oh my God, I'm going to have to prove myself because it's scary as hell. Because I left Vietnam at the age of 11 going on 12. I didn't speak English. French was my second language. And so here I am, 13 years later in America, thinking I'm going to be an American writer, which is pretty cheeky in itself. But I was lucky. I found a job. I found a career in journalism. And then when I first wrote this book, it won a PEN Award. So then I think my parents kind of changed their mind. But the Vietnamese American literature has changed a lot since then. I mean, I'm not alone. In fact, you can mention Viet Nguyen and Ocean Vuong, and everyone recognizes that. And Ocean Vuong now is at the center of American literary life. After Oprah kissed him and made him, the real Midas touch is not who, but it's really Oprah, right? Because telling you, if she spits my way, I'd be famous. But good for us. Good for us that now there is such a diversified voices in Vietnamese American literature that I am free to write whatever I want. When I first started, it was always, my mom would say, oh, since you're famous now, you can write about this. And then someone else, my uncle, show up like, you should write about that. Next thing you know, you feel like this burden of story. Because what happened is when there is a community that's muted over the years, and then there's someone who has a speaker, they just want you to tell their stories. What about my own story? You know what I mean? It was really difficult and then now, of course, you have 1,000 flowers blooming. So then I think we're all free to follow our path in life in the literary sense. And so all that is good. But I thought because it is the 50 years anniversary, I'm going to read something from a distant past, and it's from Perfume Dreams, just to show you that the difficult transition of our lives in America was not always like a walk in the park, you know what I mean? So I'll read a passage from Perfume Dreams, which is a memoir. On April 28, 1975, 2 days before Saigon fell to the Communist Army and the Vietnam War ended, my family and I boarded a cargo plane full of panicked refugees and headed for Guam. I remember watching Vietnam recede into the cloudy horizon from the plane's window, a green mass of land giving way to a hazy green sea. I was 11 years old. I was confused, frightened, and from all available evidence, the khaki army tents in the Guam refugee camp, the scorching heat, the long lines for food rations, the fetid odor of the communal latrines, the freshly bulldozed ground under my sandaled feet. I was also homeless. Places and time when they can no longer be retrieved tend to turn sacrosanct. Home forever lost is forever bathed in a certain twilight glow. Even after many years in America, my mother still longed for the ancestral altar on which Grandpa's faded black and white photos stared out into our abandoned home. She missed the carved rosewood cabinet in which she kept the enamel-covered family albums and my father's special wines from Bordeaux. And she yearned for the antique porcelain dining set covered by faded blue silk. She fretted over the small farm we owned near the Bin Lai Bridge on the outskirts of Saigon, where the chicken roamed freely and the mangosteen and guava trees were heavy with fruits when we last visited, and where the river, dotted with water hyacinths, ran swift and strong. This is a time of year when the guavas back home are ripe, and Mother would tell the family at dinner time. So far from home, Mother nevertheless took her reference points in autumn, her favorite season. Autumn, the dark season, came in the form of letters she received from relatives and friends left behind. Brown and flimsy, thin like dead leaves, recycled who knows how many times, the letters threatened to dissolve with a single tear. They unanimously told of tragic lives. Auntie and her family barely survived. Cousin is caught for the umpteenth time trying to escape. Uncle has died from heart failure while being interrogated by the Viet Cong. Yet another uncle is indefinitely incarcerated in a malaria-infested re-education camp. And no news yet of cousin and family who disappeared in the South China Sea. The letters went on to inquire as to our health and then to timidly ask for money for antibiotics, for a bicycle, and if possible, for sponsorship to America. The letters confirmed what my mother, who had lived through 2 wars, had always known. Life is a sea of suffering, and sorrow gives meaning to life. Then, as if to anchor me in old world tragedy, as if to bind me to that shared narrative of loss and misery, Mother insisted that I too read those letters. What did I do? I skimmed, I skipped, I shrugged. I put on a poker face and raked autumn in a pile and pushed it all back to her. That country, I slowly announced in English, as if to wound, is cursed. That country, mind you, no longer mine. Vietnam was now so far away, an abstraction, and America was now so near, outside the window, blaring on TV, written in the science fiction books I devoured like mad, a seduction. Besides, what could a scrawny refugee teenager living in America do to save Uncle from that malaria-infested re-education camp? What could he do for cousin and family lost somewhere in the vast South China Sea? He could, on the other hand, pretend amnesia to save himself from grief. My mother made the clucking sounds of disapproval with her tongue, and she shouted, and she shook her head. She looked into my eyes and called me the worst thing she could muster. You've become a little American now, haven't you? Đồ cowboy, a cowboy. Vietnamese appropriate the word cowboy from the movies to imply selfishness. A cowboy in Vietnamese estimation is a rebel who, as in the spaghetti western, leaves home the communal life to ride alone into the sunset. Mother's comments smarted, but she wasn't far from the truth. Her grievances against America had little to do with the war and the United States' involvement in it. Her complaint against America was that it had stolen her children, especially her youngest and once most filial son. America seduced him with its optimism, twisted his thinking, bent his tongue, and dulled his tropic memories. America gave him freeways and fast food and silly cartoons and sitcoms, imbuing him with sappy, happy ending incitements. Yet it could not be helped. For the refugee child in America, the world splits perversely into 2 irreconcilable parts, inside and outside. Inside, at home in the crowded apartment shared by 2 refugee families, nostalgia ruled. Inside, the world remained dedicated to what was. Remember the house we used to live in with the red bougainvillea wavering over the iron gate? Remember when we went to Hue and sailed down the Perfume River for the night market, and that night the sky was full of stars? Remember that when Uncle showed us that trick with the cards? Inside, the smell of fish sauce wafted along with the smell of incense from the newly built altar. that housed photos of the dead, a complex smell of loss. Inside, the refugee father told and retold wartime stories to his increasingly disaffected children, reliving the battles he had fought and won. He stirred his whiskey and soda on ice, then stared blankly at the TV. Inside, the refugee mother grieved for lost relatives, lost home and hearth, lost ways of life, a whole cherished world of intimate connections, scattered and uprooted, gone, gone, all gone. And so inside, I, the refugee child, felt the collected weight of history on my shoulders and fell silent. Outside, however, what do you want to do when you grow up? Mr. K, the English teacher in 8th grade, asked. I had never thought of the question before. Such an American question. But it intrigued me. I did not hesitate. A movie star, I answered, laughing. Outside, I was ready to believe, to swear that the Vietnamese child who grew up in that terrible war and who saw many strange, tragic, and marvelous things was someone else, not me. That it had happened in another age, centuries ago. That Vietnamese boy never grew up. He wanders still in the garden of my childhood memory. Was I had gone on, hadn't I? It was a feeling that I could not help. I came to America at a peculiar age, pubescent and not fully formed, old enough to remember Vietnam. I was also young enough to embrace America and to be shaped by it. Outside in school among new friends, I spoke English freely and deliberately. I whispered sweet compliments to Chinese and Filipino girls and made them blush. I cussed and joked with friends and made them laugh. I bantered and cavorted with teachers and made myself their pet. Speaking English, I had a markedly different personality than when speaking Vietnamese. In English, I was sunny, upbeat, silly, and sometimes wickedly sharp-tongued kid. No sorrow, no sadness, no cataclysmic grief clung to my new language. A wild river full of possibilities flowed effortlessly from my tongue, connecting me to the new world. And I, enamored by the discovery of a newly invented self, I sailed its iridescent waters towards spring. Thank you.
I find the endings all quite interesting, many of them. In Chinese, we call it, I believe, a blank. So you don't finish the story, it just all of a sudden done. And I wonder, is there any reasons behind it? Why you do that?
Short stories tend to capture the most elevated moment in humans' experience. And the reason why someone tells something like, the other day, this happened to me, it's like something out of the norm happened and it leaves an impression. And then you go home, it's like, I can't believe that happened to me, that sort of thing, right? And there is no real ending to that experience because, for instance, like some of my favorite stories, I reread them and they have different meanings as I grow older. Because a story is something that impresses you and then you still don't know why it does until years later. Because it has something that has to do with you or your understanding of the world, but its meaning is hidden, because so many layers to it. And I think people expect a novel to work the way a short story work like the way the novel does, which has beginning, middle, and end. But I think the best stories are the ones that leave you wondering, because you see this couple, these two people on the plane, they tell their stories, and then you live the life of imagination after the story ends, because you can see maybe he finds his happiness, maybe she made peace with her past, all those things. But a short story cannot give you that, it can only suggest it. Because if it gives you that, it's not satisfying, because you think it's ended. But in fact, the story goes on because it only suggests a possibility of transformation. It doesn't make you transform, but it gives you an idea of that.
Thank you for your stories. They're really great. I'm just curious, how do you come up with them? Are they based on kernels of truth or just purely conjured up from your...
Yeah, people ask that question and it's hard to say because every story has a different seeds of imagination from it. This one is from reading Hannah Arendt, what's her name? Yeah. And it's about two people on a train going back to Germany after the war, and they share their stories. And from that reading, I thought, oh yeah, I mean, I can see two people going on the plane to Vietnam and sharing their stories. Because I hear people on the plane telling stories all the time. Sometimes something like that happens. But in Stories from the HOC, there's a story that was written in a dream. I actually had a very vivid dream. And when I woke up, I was in tears because the whole story was told that one night. And my only task is to remember and tell it. And that never happened to me before or after. And so it was just a matter of transcribing it from memory. And then there were other times in this book, there's this story called Slingshot, where I went to a pho restaurant in San Francisco, and this couple was very polite, older couple who said things like, what do you want to order, sir? Are you ready to order, ma'am? That sort of thing. And they have a daughter who's like loudmouth and cursing and screaming in the back of the restaurant. It's like, fuck you, mom, I'm gonna kick your ass. And here they are like, how are you today? You know? And I was laughing my head off because of this contradiction, you know? But then I went home and her voice stuck. And then I had to write this whole short story called Slingshot because she haunted me for 6 months until that story ended. Yeah. So yeah, it's weird, the live imagination. It's the same thing as this in here. There was another story that came from having a flu, and then I couldn't do anything. I just sat there and I wrote this one story called Grandma's Tales that's sort of anthologized up the gazoo. But and I wrote that in 3 days. You know, it's from a flu. Like I couldn't do anything but hear this kid's voice, and I just wrote it. So the creative writing process is kind of weird. Whereas like memoir, you have to stay true to your memory, so then it's different because it's more like architecture. You have to stay true to that historical moment. But with fiction, sometimes you just let the character lead you.
I mean, now that it's been 5 decades now that Vietnamese Americans, have been here in the U.S., if you feel that there's a different kind of story that needs to be told now, and what is that, and what are the stories that you're finding that you are producing and that you're seeing from others at this moment?
Right.
Because it is a whole nother,
Sure.
multiple generations after. So what's that?
Yeah, so what is the story of our people? It's an interesting one because when I started, every story is the story of our people because none of it was told. And it was an open field. But after a couple decades and there are stories about both people and people surviving, hardship, the second generation that came along feel both obligated and resentful. Because I have younger generations say, why must I tell the boat people's story? And I say, who told you that you need to tell the boat people's story? But they feel like because, everyone tells that story that they feel like this sense like I have to share that story. Then there are people who are against telling that story and are resentful of people telling the boat people's story because like, it's a cliche now, why are you telling that story? You know what I mean? But it's always a tension about what's told and what should be told. Especially now that we move on from that original pain and diaspora beginning. And so it's complicated by the fact that some feel obligated and some resentful. But I think that a young Vietnamese American writer should have the freedom not to tell anything or feel obligation to say anything that the family want them to say. Because if you're from a mainstream white person narrative, you don't feel that obligation. You're just individual telling a story, and if you feel like you need to tell that story, and tell that story. I personally just find that telling the same story over again when you actually didn't experience it kind of lose that power because unless you do something so new that story has a new life to it. Like Quy Nguyen, who did about refugee, but it was told in a way that it was inversed, that the American had broken English and the Vietnamese refugee spoke fluent English. And then at first you're like, I don't get it. It's like, why are the Vietnamese speaking fluent English with slangs and everything, and the white guy who is the military person is speaking with a broken English. And then near the end, you realize that he was telling it as if English was Vietnamese, and that the white guy was speaking Vietnamese. You know what I mean? And I'm like, oh, okay, so it's told inversely. And so then you're like, oh, this is new. You know what I mean? So I think once everything is done already, you need to either say something new. It's called Viet Gone, and or don't do it, because it's becoming a cliche if you do it. Unless you add something new to it. But I cannot tell, say, your child what to write. Because I think your child has to come up with a new invention of what matters to her. So it would be presumptuous to say, second generation should write this and third generation should write that, because you know what? They will hate your ass, But personally, I would love to see point of view that is larger than a domestic point of view, which is to say, we Asian Americans in general tend to have this resentment of the power that be, and the tension between, and the race relation kind of thing. And we always see ourselves within one border. Whereas like some of the global writing are so marvelous because they're not bound to it. Someone like Kazuo Ishiguro, he can be all over the world. He can see the world on so many different levels. Whereas I think for us who come out of certain social science and social study, we tend to carry this resentment about race and identity, and we still dwell within that framework. Not to say that there's anything wrong with it, but that I wish there was something more expansive that covered the world, especially now that we live in such a complex time, and so that someone can tie San Francisco to Saigon to Paris or something in one breath. It would be it's beautiful to read.
To the extent you have certain short stories that you've already finished, has it dawned to you to pick some of these stories and rework them again in some expanded version? And what would that be, and how would it look like?
One of the things about being a writer is that you're never happy with what you wrote. So even now, as I'm reading a lot of my work, I feel like I should go back and edit all of them, because you yourself change, Like the Buddha said, no one steps in the same river twice. And I think whatever I understood the world when I wrote those pieces, now that they're published and people read them, I read them too. I'm like, yeah, I think I should add that or fix this, because there is no perfection. There's only a story, right? And so for me, it's like, oh my God, I should come back and fix that or take that out or take this in, because a work of art is never really a finished piece of work. I don't think an artist should say, yeah, this thing is perfect, because if he's already said that, he should kill himself, But I think for me, there are pieces that I want to not necessarily rewrite, but to add on. Like there are pieces that I want to add on to. In fact, there's one story in here that sort of survived a second life in here, which is from a stand-up comedian. And he's a stand-up comedian, and for some reason he makes his return, and he tells other stories in the second book, and because he makes me laugh. I mean, and I talk about my characters as outsider because they're real to me, and so when they make a joke, I'm like, I can't believe you just said that, but they're funny to me, and so this guy, he's pretty seriously funny. So he gets to come back to be a social commentator. Maybe because I always wanted to be a stand-up comedian, maybe. But so yeah. But I think a good story should just has its own life and be left there, because if you're gonna revise, you're not gonna be finished. So there's also many stories to write anyway. So you gotta create new ones. Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.